Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
Welcome to Mortification of Spin. My name's Carl Trueman, your host, professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College in beautiful Western Pennsylvania. And here, as always, with my friend and fellow host, the Reverend Todd Pruitt, pastor of
Covenant Presbyterian Church, Carl.
The mind went blank there.
That's okay. That's okay. Just because you've been our guest there on several different occasions and have known me for all these years, that's all right.
Yeah. In Harrisonburg, Virginia. I no longer say Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, that's good. We've made progress.
Virginia.
Yeah,
that's great. Well,
we've made progress.
Great to see you.
And really, if you'll just remember Covenant, because like 65% of PCA churches are called Covenant Presbyterian Church, so that's all you need.
The OPC church I go to is Covenant Presbyterian Church, so there really is no excuse.
There you go.
Point.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Well, it's good to see you, Carl.
It's good to see you too. Everything well in PCA world?
Everything's well. I do want to alert our listeners to the fact that I am wearing a shirt with buttons and a collar, and you are wearing a T-shirt right now. So I want to get that out there.
It's true.
I don't know what's going on.
It's out of term time, so I'm not my usually sartorial, elegant self. And,
right.
And I think that might be the reason why my computer was refusing to boot up just now. It didn't recognize me, whatever software they've got on.
Right. If you have a facial recognition thing, I'm sure it got very confused. Yes. Yeah.
Well, I'm very excited with the guest we have today. He is a returning guest. He's been on several times before. He and I have been in intermittent communication now for, I think, nearly 30 years. Actually, over the years on various topics. When I edited Themelius way back in the day, Doug Groothuis, our guest today, submitted several articles and was published, always very, very helpfully so within the magazine. So it's great to welcome Professor Douglas Groothuis. For those of you who don't know him, he is currently professor of philosophy at Denver Seminary, but in the next academic year, he's moving to Cornerstone University in Grand Rapids, where he's going to take up a research professorship. Where I think essentially he's paid to read books, teach a bit, have great thoughts, and advise the faculty. So it's the kind of job that guys like me can only dream of having. But great to have you with us, Doug, and many congratulations on this new prestigious appointment.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be back. And Carl, we just went through your book in a class at Denver Seminary called Cultural Apologetics. And we spent about 5 weeks on it and still didn't do justice to it. So I want to thank you again for that terrific, insightful book.
That's very kind of you. Very kind of you. And of course, we're having you on today because you have written a very helpful and insightful book. For many years now, I've loved introducing students at various points to the thinking, the thought of Blaise Pascal, the wonderful 17th-century scientist and Christian philosopher. But one of the things that I've never been able to lay my hands on has been a convenient, satisfying introduction to his thought that would help young people realize how relevant so much of his own thinking, of Pascal's own thinking, is for us today, particularly in the kind of culture, the entertainment-saturated, decadent culture in which we find ourselves. Your book fills that gap. It's entitled Beyond the Wager, The Christian Brilliance of Blaise Pascal. It's available from InterVarsity Press, and it's a delight to have you on to talk about it, Doug.
Well, thank you. This book is an update of a book that came out 20 years ago called On Pascal, which was published by Wadsworth. They had a series on all the great philosophers, and I noticed they did not have one on Pascal, so I had the audacity to contact the series editor and said, I think I'm your man for On Pascal. So that came out 20 years ago, but it has been substantially updated and revised. I didn't have to really change a lot, but I've added 4 new chapters, plus I also have an appendix where I have some fun, where I set up a dialogue between Descartes and Pascal in heaven. And I'm more certain that Pascal is there than Descartes, but in the spirit of charity, I put both of them there.
I think Descartes was well-meaning, we might say.
I defend Descartes more than a lot of people do, but
yeah.
I have no doubt about Blaise Pascal, given his deep piety and love for Christ.
Yes. Well, perhaps, I mean, many of our listeners may not actually have heard of Blaise Pascal or be particularly knowledgeable about his Christian context. I wonder if you could just, first of all, Doug, give us that 30,000-foot introduction to who is Blaise Pascal? Why should Christians today be interested in him?
Well, there's so many reasons. He was a 17th century scientist, philosopher, theologian, and I think really one of the great geniuses of all time. A good word for him would be polymath, because he was a theoretical scientist. He worked in the philosophy of science, which I talk about, and he also was an experimental scientist. He created the first working calculator, and he experimented on nature. There was a time in his day when people said nature abhors a vacuum, and he said, we actually need to go test that. So he devised a great, brilliant test to show that nature did not abhor a vacuum. He thought it was a bit odd that you give natural qualities emotional characteristics to begin with. That was part of his philosophy of science, challenging some Aristotelian and Cartesian ideas. And he was also a defender of the Christian faith. He had endeavored to write a thorough defense of Christianity, but sadly he died at age 39 in 1662. He was not able to finish that work, but he's left us a collection of thoughts. And when you find this in the bookstore, it's typically called pensées, which is French for thoughts. And they were so insightful and brilliant that after his death, it was assembled into a book, and various editors have been working on that for years. I like to use the Penguin edition myself, edited by Albin Krailshamer. So we have some fragments that are fairly long and understandable in and of themselves. The wager fragment is like that, although you have to put the wager fragment into a larger context. Some are very, very short. My favorite short fragment is, the parrot wipes its beak even though it's not dirty. You think, what a profound apologetic thought, you know? I actually think I know why he has that in there, but it's a challenge to put it all together. But I think one of his most brilliant aspects of his thought is his understanding and reflection on human nature. And he has an argument from human nature for the Christian worldview that I have been thinking about and writing about and speaking on for many, many years, over 40 years. And I have a chapter in the book called Deposed Royalty that deals with that. So the short answer is, he was an utterly brilliant man. I think the most brilliant man of the 17th century in Europe, both as a scientist and as an apologist, as well as a philosopher and theologian. Just remarkable man in so many ways.
You know, some of our listeners have pastors that like to read. They may have heard Pascal quoted from the pulpit. I know I have. I've read the Pensées going back, probably started reading it off and on 20 years ago or more. And because his mind functioned the way it is, you know, he has these wonderful nuggets like any good, really good philosopher will have. He's able to kind of summarize some profound thoughts in a simple way. Now he's been, some have praised his thinking in terms of the wager specifically. I want to ask you about that in a minute, but others have criticized the wager. And I think the criticism has been unfair, because I think from what I've read over the years of some of those who've criticized his quote unquote wager, they seem to be reading it out of a larger context, I think, is one of the problems. But I wonder if you would just kind of tell our folks, what is Pascal's wager and what is the value you see in it?
Right. Well, my book is called Beyond the Wager because I think sometimes Pascal is reduced to Pascal's wager, and it's typically not put in the proper context. Pascal is really dealing with what we call prudential reasoning. So some of our beliefs don't have that much importance, really, and other beliefs have tremendous importance. And Pascal's insight is that if Christianity is true and you fail to believe it, then you lose everything and gain nothing, essentially. And he uses that as a motivation for someone to seek the truth about Christianity. As he puts it, listen to God. Now, it's often put in a very uncharitable way as something like this: no one knows whether or not there is a God. In case there is a God, we should believe in him so we can go to heaven and avoid hell.
Right.
Well, that's not what he was doing. There are some mysteries, there are some contested aspects to the wager. For example, at the very beginning, he seems to say that we really can't have theoretical knowledge whether God exists or not. So therefore, we have to pursue believing in light of the prudential outcomes. But I think that's probably a wrong reading, because he gives such strong arguments for the truth and rationality of Christianity throughout the Pensées. I think what he's doing is he's dealing with a skeptic who can't be budged off the dime by evidence.
Mm-hmm.
But the skeptic believes that if Christianity is true, there are great benefits in believing it, but he just can't find himself in a place of believing it. So Pascal says there are reasons to believe, but there's another aspect, and this is what could be called the devotional experiment. He says, engage in religious practices and you'll find that you end up believing. Now, on this one, people take a very uncharitable view as well. And they say, he's just telling you to brainwash yourself, auto-suggestion.
Right.
In case it is true, make yourself believe. But I think he's onto something that people sometimes miss. My basic principle is Pascal is smarter than you are. So if you think he said something ridiculous, I think we know who's wrong. And even when Pascal is wrong, he's brilliant. I think he was wrong about natural theology, but that's another topic.
Mm-hmm.
So it has to do with the fact that we are rational beings, but we also have intuition, and we're also affected by habitual behavior. And Pascal understands this as the order of the mind, the order of the heart, and the order of the body. And they all contribute to our knowing. So Pascal says that knowing is more than just theoretically reflecting on the arguments for something. It also relates to the kind of practices we're involved with. So it would make sense if someone is at least interested in Christianity, but they're not convinced by apologetics. Let's say they haven't read my book on apologetics yet, that they would attend a church service or go to a Bible study or even a prayer meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Because in that setting, one might be able to better understand what Christianity is, in a sense to perhaps ameliorate or neutralize some of the passions that keep us from believing. It's not always reasons that keep us from believing the gospel. It may be settled habits of sin and so on. So I have a whole chapter on the wager. I think it's quite brilliant, and I try to defend it against various caricatures that have been raised against it.
Yeah, that's really good, Doug. I think while you were talking that way, I was thinking of Charles Taylor, of course, and the social imaginary, and the way he deploys that in a secular age to demonstrate that, belief and unbelief, it's more than just an argument. Very few of us actually believe or disbelieve because we heard an argument that we thought was watertight and transformed our lives. It's much more complicated than that. And that's what I love about that kind of Augustinian tradition, that you have that rich understanding of the emotions in the heart and the way that plays.
Well, and Pascal was definitely an Augustinian because he was involved with a reform movement in the Roman Catholic Church called the Jansenists. And they emphasized that we are disabled by sin, that we have to radically depend on the sovereign grace of God. The Christian life is something that is serious. So he's part of that grand Augustinian tradition that takes the disorders of the heart very seriously.
One of my historical frustrations is that John Owen, that I wrote on in sort of earlier in my career, makes a comment somewhere that he's read all of the stuff, the material on the Jansenists, and he's going to write this sort of theological analysis and history of Jansenism. never gets around to doing it. It would have
Oh
been
gosh, that would have been
superb
great.
to have had one of the finest Puritan reform minds engaging with really his counterpart within the Roman Catholic Church. So tell us a bit though about Pascal's Christology. That's always interested me. 'Cause often scholars draw a comparison between, or theologians between, Luther's Christology with this heavy emphasis on the hiddenness of God under the flesh of Christ, and that of Blaise Pascal. What could readers glean from not simply the philosophical and apologetic aspects of Pascal, but also the more distinctively Christian Christological dimensions?
Well, Pascal was a profoundly Christological thinker, and some of the treatments of his work don't point this out adequately. So I have a quote on page 132 where he summarizes what he calls Christ's offices. And you could write a book simply going through what he says. Let me just read this. He alone had to produce a great people, elect holy and chosen, lead them, feed them, bring them into the place of rest and holiness, make them holy for God, make them the temple of God, reconcile them with God, save them from God's anger, redeem them from the bondage of sin, which visibly reigns in man, give laws to his people, write these laws on their hearts, offer himself to God for them, sacrifice himself for them, be a spotless sacrifice, and himself the sacrificer, having himself to offer up his body and blood, and yet offer up bread and wine to God. And in the book, I take that statement and divide it into 9 parts of all that Christ has done and what he has achieved. And then I have 3 more statements. So he's summarizing very likely what he would have written more about. And that's the genius and the frustration that we experience with the Pensées, because many of his notes are programmatic. But even in their programmatic, simplified form, they're very profound. So Pascal said, we actually can't know anything truly apart from Christ. And I have a quote to that effect in the book as well. And the point of the Pensées is for the worldly unbeliever of his day, the skeptic, to come to Christ as Lord and Savior. That was the point of his entire apologetic. So he was a profoundly Christological thinker, and I think this has devotional application to us as well. He says there's no one as happy as the true Christian. So sometimes people misconstrue the wager as saying that it's all about heaven and the afterlife. It certainly addresses that, and we should be concerned about such matters. But Pascal thought there was a profound spiritual reality to being a Christian in this life. And that was part of the emphasis of the Jansenists, and it's Augustinian and it's biblical. It goes back to the living Christ himself. So I have a chapter in the book called The Excellence of Jesus. And one thing I try to do in the book is address some topics that works on Pascal usually avoid or often don't say enough about, such as his Christology, his views on Islam, and also his views of society, because he was a very cogent, trenchant critic of the illusions of society. And how much do we need that today, certainly. He was worried about spin in his day, and how much more do we have to deal with spin across social media and all the rest of it today.
Doug, you address some of the criticism that some have leveled over the years against Pascal's thinking, kind of accusing him of fideism, and I think your response to that is really helpful. And I wonder, how did Pascal seem to understand the relationship between faith and reason?
Well, he was certainly not a fideist. If
Right.
by fideist you mean someone who thinks that believing in Christianity can receive no support from reason or evidence. Pascal did not believe that. His argument from human nature is certainly an apologetic for the whole Christian worldview, where he says that only the Christian understanding of humanity explains our greatness and our misery and gives us hope. So creation, fall, redemption. And the other philosophies and worldviews either overestimate humanity or underestimate humanity, and no other worldview gives us the hope of real redemption through Jesus Christ. Now, Pascal did reject natural theology, and I have a chapter addressing that. I said earlier that even when I think he's wrong, he's still brilliant. So I think his reasons for rejecting natural theology are significant and need to be addressed. In fact, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on that, but I mercifully shrunk it down to one small chapter in the book. So he's got this idea that, as I mentioned earlier, that we have the three orders of knowing, the mind, the heart, and the body, and they all work together. And he's famous for saying this quote, "The heart has reasons that reason knows nothing of." And like the wager, people have misinterpreted this. They've said, oh, he's an irrationalist. The heart must mean emotion or untutored intuition or something like that. Well, again, Pascal is smarter than you are. Yeah. So if you look at what he says about the heart, what he means is rational intuition. Mm-hmm. And fragment 110 in the Penguin edition goes into some detail about that. And contemporary philosophers deal with what they call properly basic belief. People like Alvin Plantinga, Bill Craig talks about the internal witness of the Holy Spirit. That's roughly what Pascal is addressing. It's not that the heart is divorced from reason or evidence, or that the heart is irrational. He means simply there's some things we know a priori through rational intuition, but we still have evidential reasons to believe in Christ. He uses the argument from fulfilled prophecy, the genius of Christ's teaching. He has some very suggestive and insightful fragments about the resurrection as the best explanation for what happened to Jesus. So he was definitely not a fideist, but he also realized that there were limits as to what science could tell us. And he was the greatest experimental scientist of the day. He wrote on the philosophy of science, but he realized that science cannot tell us everything we need to know about reality. And there's a fragment that talks about those who probe science too deeply or try to find things in science that we could only find in biblical revelation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really helpful. As I was reading that particular section, going back and rereading a couple parts of it, one of the things that occurred to me was, we have some great, Christian scientists, people like John Lennox and others who are still making those same points, who are still appealing to that same reality. And, of course, Pascal was doing it in the 17th century. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, and I think, we benefit from Pascal's apologetic as it is. We can also supplement it with natural theology. Mm-hmm. Especially you think of the work of someone like Stephen Meyer and all the evidence for a creator and a designer. From cosmology, we have the Big Bang account, we have fine-tuning. And I've written about all that in my own book, Christian Apologetics, over 200 pages. Mm-hmm. But the amazing thing about Pascal is you can even bracket that and still have a compelling argument for Christianity.
Right. Yeah.
But you can make it even stronger when you add natural theology to it, which is what I do. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Here's a sort of, I guess, kind of coming to a close kind of question, Doug. But one thing that's always fascinated me, and I have my own answer to this, but do you think that the thoughts, the pensées, are greater because Pascal died before he was able to sort of knit them into this great treatise? I mean, to me, it's always been, it's like, in some ways, like the book of Proverbs. I find it hard to believe that the completed work could have been more stimulating and provocative than the sort of gnomic fragments that are thrown out. What's your, it's just a fun final question from me.
It is. And
what's your take on that?
Yeah, I do bring that up in the book. That was Malcolm Muggeridge's take on it.
Oh.
It certainly gave us a lot of work to do over these hundreds of years, trying to put them together in ways that we think are faithful to Pascal and which give us a cogent argument. I would love to have seen the finished version. He gives us some programmatic fragments. For example, He says, order, men despise religion. They hate it and are afraid it may be true. The cure for this is to first show that religion is not contrary to reason, but worthy of reverence and respect. Next, make it attractive. Make good men wish it were true, and then show that it is. So there's the idea of longing.
Yeah.
Worthy of reverence because it really understands human nature. There's this anthropological argument. Attractive because it promises true good, and there's the wager argument. So we've got the programmatic fragment as to what the whole work would look like, and that can help guide us as we arrange the fragments and try to understand what he ultimately said. But I think Pascal is one of the most quotable of all the classic philosophers. And anytime I try to paraphrase him, I feel guilty afterwards. It's sort of like with C.S. Lewis. Just read the quotes. In fact, I got the Kindle edition of Ponce's in the Penguin edition. And at one point, I had maxed out the allowable quotes that you could take from it.
Wow. Yeah.
And I somehow got access to it again. But you really want to read Pascal. And if you write about him, you want to quote him and do justice to what he said, because it really was so insightful and profoundly put, especially his comments about what it means to be a human being and his reflections on the nature of knowing Christ. They're really not just philosophically insightful and stimulating, but also devotionally compelling.
That's good. Well, our guest has been Professor Douglas Groothuis of Denver Seminary, and his latest book, Beyond the Wager, The Christian Brilliance of Blaise Pascal, is a really wonderful read. I hope you've gotten a taste for that in this discussion. It is a read that delves into deep issues, but is written in such a way that it's accessible and enjoyable to read. And I do commend it to you. And I would encourage you, when you get a chance, to go to our website, mortificationofspin.org, and you can register to win a copy of this wonderful new book, Beyond the Wager. And we would encourage you to do that. And while you're there, if you'd like to make a contribution to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can do that as well. But again, we want to thank our guest, Doug Groothuis, for being with us yet again, one of our return guests. We're always pleased when someone's willing to actually come back on, but we enjoy him as a guest because he continues to produce material that is worth reading, and we're so thankful that he was with us today. Well, we look forward to being with you next time on Mortification of Spin.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.